First of all, I would like to thank Katrina for inviting me to talk to her class. It's always been a good exercise to do that, and she's asked me to do chapter 4, which is an interesting chapter. It's one in which introduces people to resources, their uses, and we'll see how, and sometimes it's misuses of resources. And throughout all of this, that we'll find that geography is a very practical discipline. And so I'll be suggesting even career choices for people. So anyway, let's see where this goes. You'll see at the beginning of the chapter that resources are defined, and of course it's any naturally occurring substance which is of value to society. And of course that's the key, of value to society. In other words, resources are culturally defined. And there's a few examples in the books of things like herring roe and so on. I've selected another one here, and it has implications, of course, for Canada in terms of how resources are culturally defined. You see, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, that the fashion was the felt hat, as you can see here. And of course, you make felt hats from the skin of beavers. And so this is really what initiated the fur trade, is really fashion. And of course, this was huge in Canada. And of course, it was very unfortunate for the poor beaver in all of that. But then, as it suggests in the text, that of course values can change over time, and they did. In fact, you can see I put another top hat on here, which is the Victorian silk top hat, and of course that became the new fashion. Is silk that came from Japan became the new fashion. So of course then what happens to the price of furs? And of course we know it declines. And so this is another issue that we're going to find resources that they can fluctuate both up and down in terms of their value. And then again, this is what I've called career choice for geographers, and there's so many geographers get involved in resource management. So here's a particular path that some of you may want to follow, and I've used 3 examples here, which is really about the overlapping values that are related to resources. And so, I mean, water has amazing number of values, and you can see I put some there, potable, in other words, for drinking, and some like rivers and streams and lakes for swimming, and of course it's important for fish habitat, and we think of all the salmon, and of course then there's the people who are the anglers, they like fishing, and other people like boating, and then all of a sudden those are all complementary things. In other words, you need clear and clean, safe water. And then along comes the idea of hydroelectricity. Now we have to make some choices. This means damming the river. And if we dam the river, then of course that's going to stop salmon from migrating. So those are choices that have to be made. In other instances, I put effluent disposal, and this of course is by industry, this is by municipalities that often flush out their wastes into water, and now it's no longer good for swimming. So again, these are choices, and that's what resource management is all about. And similar things can be said about forests, forests for hiking, forests for animal habitat, old growth values. We know that forests absorb carbon dioxide, which helps clean up the atmosphere and improve climate change. And then we also know that we use the forest for lumber. And again, it's a question of how many trees do we take down? How much of the forest do we use up? And then, of course, we also know that we have to be careful of forest fires. That depletes the number of forests that we have. And then, of course, we know about mountain pine beetle and these infestations in forests. So again, there's a need for management for this. And then there's salmon, and it's really a question of, you think about like who's entitled, who deserves salmon. And of course, we know that the commercial fishing interests have been there since the 1870s. And then we know that individuals like to catch fish. And of course, we know that First Nations rely on salmon forever. Orcas depend upon salmon, and then of course the U.S. Because of course migrating salmon come through American waters before they enter rivers like the Fraser, and so they get a share of salmon. So it's a complex issue in terms of how salmon are managed. And here's a model, a simple model of being able to weigh resources and really into two categories, both renewable and non-renewable. So the renewable are biotic, or we're talking about plants and animals, things such as forests, fish, vegetation, wildlife, even people. But then I put down there only within their biological limits, meaning that if we're not careful, then that's where extinction comes in. And we'll see that there has been all kinds of plants and animals that have become extinct. And here in British Columbia, we have had the same kinds of issues of extinction or near extinction. And so that's that whole issue of sustainable development, and again, a need for resource management. On the non-renewable side, of course, there are the non-living, or what are called abiotic resources, and then we're talking about metals and hydrocarbons and non-metals like asbestos and things like that. And so they're often called fixed or finite. In other words, there's only so much copper in a deposit or whatever. But again, it often depends on technologies. And so we think that the oil well has been exhausted or the natural gas well has been exhausted. Well, for oil, they know that oil floats on water. And so if you pump water down, then you can get more oil out. And so that's a technology that was being used. And today it's more about fracking. And so this is a whole new technology, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And so when we think something is finite or that it's going to run out, new technologies may make it last a lot longer. Then the ecosystem model is a model that puts things in perspective. And again, from resource management perspective, this is an important one. It starts out by fundamental resources, in other words, the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere, in other words, air, water, and land. And by fundamental, this means that they're fundamental to life. In other words, add sunlight and you have photosynthesis, and this is the start of life. And so those are pretty critical resources. And then on one side you have living resources, and of course those are the renewable resources, and the other side non-living resources, and those are the non-renewable resources. But what's happened over time, and we're going to show this in another module, is that society's greater dependence on non-living resources has resulted in increased carbon, leading to climate change, massive oil spills, industrial and municipal waste in the air, water, and land, failure of tailing ponds from mining. In other words, the non-living resources have affected the fundamental resources. In other words, it gets into the air, the water, and the land, which in turn affects the living resources, so plants and animals, and even us. And so in many issues, it's often a health issue for us. And so again, it tries to put those things in perspective, and again, that need for management of these resources. And then here's another view of resources. Harold Innes is a Canadian economist back in the 1920s, and he developed staples theory, which I've said here, a uniquely Canadian theory on economic development. And really it's about how do you get the economy going? And what he suggested is that really, if we look at the resources in Canada, because this is overall Canada, that there's a whole east to west movement by the resources that we have. The one exception, as we'll see, is minerals. And so he basically said, if you look at fish, furs, timber, wheat, and minerals, that at least the first four really go from the Newfoundland, the Maritimes, and west across Canada. So the fish, or the codfish, of course, off the Grand Banks, and that was the initial lure of many Europeans coming to North America. And then, of course, then there's the fur trade, which we talked a little bit about with felt hats. But of course, there's all kinds of other furs, and that resulted in all kinds of conflicts, particularly between the French and the British, over who controlled the fur trade. But that's, of course, moved into central Canada and then moved farther west. And then timber, which also started in the east and then kept moving farther west, and of course, even right through to British Columbia. And finally, wheat. And wheat really means agriculture, and while wheat may have been the most important staple in agriculture, it of course refers to all kinds of agriculture, including ranching. And, and minerals, of course, are the one that really doesn't. It's somewhat haphazard. So there's a gold rush in British Columbia, and then they find cobalt in Ontario, and then there's another gold rush in the Yukon. So it's all over the place, but nevertheless, of course, it brings employment. Now, employment. So how you gain that employment through Staples theories, Innes used the term linkages. And he had three different kinds of linkages: backward, forward, and final demand. And so first of all, there's the main assumption that there has to be an external demand for your resource. And so backward linkages really mean all the ways to get resources back to where that demand is. And what he said is the most important backward linkage, of course, is transportation. And in those days, of course, it was the railway. And if you think about, all the things that go into railways, you got to have, the rails, the ties, the locomotives. Who builds the locomotives? Where ships? Who builds the ships? Then there's warehouses, and then there's all the repair facilities. And so he's saying that transportation will give you the greatest number of people employed as a backward linkage. Forward linkages, of course, is now you have the resource. What can you do with it? Like, how can you add value to it? And of course, an ongoing issue in British Columbia is that you cut down the trees, you sell off raw logs. And people say, no, that we can get a lot more value. In other words, we can get a lot more people employed and get a lot more value out of that if we at least turned into lumber. And we do that as well. And others would say, well, let's go further and let's turn into sash and door, and or even musical instruments. There's a way more value. And another simple example, because many of you will go out and buy a bag of chips, and if you think about it, they come from potatoes, and potatoes are not terribly expensive. And what do you need? You need 3 potatoes to make a bag of chips, and look at the value of the bag of chips. And so those are forward linkages and value added, and of course there's processing and people employed in doing all those kinds of things. And then there's final demand linkages, and here it's really for the local market, and I've shown a picture here of Barkerville, and of course ends up in the Caribou and the gold rush of the 1860s, and well, the picture is a bit faded. You notice that there's virtually no trees in the picture, and that's of course because those are the final demand linkages. I mean, wood was used for everything, and that all those buildings down there needed wood, and of course the local wood. And so there have been local sawmills that would supply that. And then there's all the flumes, and then wood, of course, was used for cooking, and wood was used for heating. And so those are all final demand linkages. And so those are important in terms of local employment that happens. The final box down here I've made a note of is that Innes suggests agriculture will give you the greatest number of linkages. In other words, what he saw is that farming, that especially, and this really applied mostly to southern Ontario and southern Quebec historically and in the 1920s form, is that here you have quite a number of farming activities and ranching activities and those kinds of things. And if you think about all the backward linkages you need for farming. You need to have your plows and harrows and later tractors and all those things to produce agriculture. And then you need all the transportation to move the product to the market. And so again, you need your roads, your railways, and all those things, and who builds those things, right? And then if we think about the forward linkages, yes, you can think about wheat, and then the wheat gets turned to flour, and then flour gets turned into all the other products that you can think about. But what about ranching and cattle and yeah, you can have your steaks, but what about the leather and all the leather products? And so you can see how agriculture and all the diverse things you can grow or raise, the huge range of employment that's related to that. And so he saw that as so important to employment within Canada. But we'll have more to say about that as we get into further models. Also, there's something called the multiplier effect. And the multiplier effect is a relatively simple concept if you think about it. So I've used a mine, and this could be in the Kootenays, and you find a rich vein of copper or lead or zinc or gold even, and so now you've got miners who are tunneling into these veins and employment in terms of working the mines. But now you've got to get the ore out, and so of course you now. This is economically viable to run a railway, and so look at the building of a railway and the bridges and all the things that were necessary. And you of course you've got to transport it to a smelter and to refine the ore. And so that smelter could be Trail, it could be Greenwood, it could be Antioch, it could be Nelson, it could be any number of places if we had smelters. But look at the number of people that you need for a smelter and the kind of housing that you have and all those demands that are there. And of course, that means that people have got to be fed. But now you've got a railway and transportation, and so now we get farms and ranches and they're going to feed the local people. Right, so those are the final demand linkages, but you're making a surplus, but now you have a railway and you can get that to port facilities or to Eastern Canada, and so on and on we get more jobs and more things happening. And of course all those houses and all those bridges and all those things that need wood. And so, of course, now railways can be used in terms of logging and getting to sawmills. And so that's that multiplier effect. It just goes on and on in terms of all the things that you need for that economy to grow. Of course, in British Columbia is the other side of that coin, which is often called the downward spiral. And we've got a lot of those in British Columbia. We call them ghost towns. And I've put a few up here. Antioch, which was a very wealthy copper mine and copper smelter on the north coast of British Columbia. But of course, copper runs out, and or world market prices collapse for a variety of reasons that we'll see. And so Antioch is no more, and Kitsault. Kitsault was a molybdenum mine, and you can see all the buildings and all those kinds of things that happened there in Kitsault. But the market collapsed for Kitsault, and so the town was essentially abandoned. Or here's Sandon. Sandon is in the Kootenays, and very wealthy town based on silver deposits in the 1890s, early 1900s, and of course those deposits ran out. And there's a picture of Sandon more or less today below it. These things, this is that downward spiral, and of course everybody loses their jobs, and so we have to keep that in the back of our mind too. So that's what we call the boom and bust economy of British Columbia. That's based on resources. And then there's Fordism, and Fordism is really a technology. And of course, it's named after Henry Ford, because of course he produced the automobiles and the Model A and so on. And you can see see them there on this assembly line of mass production that took place. And what Henry Ford used to say is, like, you can have any color you want as long as it's black. In other words, that this is a no frills, one size fits all kind of vehicle. But what was happening is that he was the first to produce a vehicle that the ordinary person could afford. See, before that, the cars were produced, but they were really what you might call luxury cars, and for people who had lots of money. He produced one that the ordinary person could afford, and of course he paid his employees well. They mass produced these vehicles, and then of course everybody a lot of people had vehicles. Now, we employed the same technologies in British Columbia, but there's a difference. So here you have, in the very early days, mass production of tins of salmon, all on an assembly line, quite labor intensive. Nevertheless, it is assembly line that's happening. Similar with lumber, is that we mass produced we call dimension lumber, 2x4s, 2x6s, and so forth. And so again, this is happening here in British Columbia, and still happens in British Columbia, and it's the same with bales of pulp. And what I've said is that, unlike what happened in places like Southern Ontario, where you have manufacturing plants of consumer goods like automobiles in large cities and large manufacturing plants, in British Columbia, that these plants were decentralized. In other words, they were on the Fraser River, canneries on the Fraser River, up on the Skeena, and on Vancouver Island, lumber mills throughout the interior and Vancouver Island, and the same with pulp mills, very decentralized. And the other thing is that they're, for the most part, what we call low value added. In other words, that tins of salmon are not hugely expensive, nor is lumber or bales of pulp. They're not like automobiles. And so, yes, we employed Fordism, but in a very different way than for final consumer products. So this is the end of our module 1, and really what we've covered is essentially the basics of what a resource is, and tried to unravel some of that complexity of resource use, and stress the importance of resource management, and it's certainly an option for people in geography, and we're going to see in our next modules is how important resource management is, because there's been a lot of misuse of resources in British Columbia here, and that continues that way. And so the models just help to unravel some of that complexity. And Staples theory really gives at least a historic view of how resources were used. We're going to question Staples theory in our next modules, and give a different perspective on Staples theory. And Fordism, as I mentioned, is really a technology of how you improve productivity. How do you get more resources to people at a cheaper price, if you like. So and that's the end of this first module.